To Lisa Cameron.
And thank you to the Honourable Member for having this debate today. It's an extremely important debate that has been brought forward in response to what is an overwhelming petition by the public. Cannabis is the most widely used illegal drug in the UK. Although it appears that there has been a steady reduction in its use since 1996, about 2.3 million 16 to 59-year-olds reported using cannabis between 2013 and 2014. Frequent use of cannabis is also about twice as likely amongst young people, with nearly 5.3 million 16 to 24-year-olds reporting having used it during the same time period. Despite government and media warnings about health risks, many people see cannabis as a harmless substance that helps you to relax and a drug that, unlike alcohol or cigarettes, might even be good for your physical or mental health. Proponents for decriminalisation have also highlighted the potential medicinal properties of cannabis and argued that legalising the production, supply and use of cannabis would also have a number of benefits for society as a whole. Many of these arguments we have heard today. Transform, a charitable think tank that campaigns for the legal regulation of drugs both in the UK and internationally, argue that the current approach of prohibition is failing and will never be successful in protecting individuals or society from the misuse of drugs. They highlight that the unintended consequence of prohibition is that it creates an illicit market which allows the drugs trade to be monopolised by organised crime factions. I've had a number of contacts from constituents in the run-up to this debate who feel extremely strongly about this issue. One of my constituents, Paul, who wished to be mentioned today, supports a motion to decriminalise cannabis due to its medicinal properties and has told me that he feels criminalising a substance produced from organic matter, which holds medicinal potential, whilst allowing over-the-counter sale of many more harmful substances, could be viewed as disproportionate, as could driving someone to use the black market to gain relief or hope from a medical condition such as multiple sclerosis, which they or a loved one are suffering from because nothing else offers the same relief. On the other hand, however, medical bodies have reported evidence indicating significant potential harm which can be caused by cannabis. As a clinical psychologist who has specialised within addiction and forensic populations in my previous career, the impact of cannabis upon mental health is of particular interest to me, and literature published by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 2014 has highlighted several issues of particular concern in this regard. Whilst it is acknowledged that not everyone who uses cannabis will develop mental health problems, even amongst those in the groups of society identified as being the most vulnerable, the Royal College of Psychiatrists publication highlights that there is growing evidence that people with serious mental illness, including depression and psychosis, are more likely to use cannabis or to have used it for long periods of time in the past. It also appears that regular use of this doubles the risk of developing a psychotic episode or long-term schizophrenia. Research has found that adolescents who use cannabis regularly have significantly higher risk of developing depression, anxiety and psychotic illnesses, such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. In example, as described by the Honourable Gentleman opposite, a longitudinal study with 1,600 Australian adolescents found that whilst children who used cannabis regularly have a significantly higher risk of depression, the opposite was not actually found to be the case. Children who already suffered from depression were not more likely than anyone else to use cannabis to ameliorate their issues. The study reportedly found that adolescents who used cannabis daily were 5 times more likely to develop depression and anxiety in later life. In terms of risks of psychosis, evidence has shown that those who use cannabis, particularly at a younger age, such as around the age of 15, when many individuals start to use cannabis, have a higher than average risk of developing a psychotic illness. It's been found that increased risk is related to increased use, and those who used cannabis were also at risk of earlier onset of illness compared to those who did not choose it. Available research does show that those who have a family history of a psychotic illness or those who have certain characteristics or vulnerability may be at increased risk of developing illness following from the regular strong use of cannabis. As has been eloquently described, research also indicates that the UK market has been flooded by stronger varieties of cannabis, such as skunk, which contains higher quantities of THC. THC is the main psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. It has been found that there is a higher risk of developing a psychotic illness from cannabis with high levels of THC, and if you're a regular user of cannabis. So the easy availability of these stronger varieties carries a specific risk to young people with a genetic predisposition. In addition, it has also been highlighted that cannabis with high amounts of THC can cause cognitive problems, such as problems with short-term memory and processing speed. Whilst in the past it was thought that cannabis was not addictive, current evidence now suggests that it can be, particularly if used regularly and heavily. I would indeed.
Obviously, we use great respect to the Honourable Lady because of her expertise, as we did to my Honourable friend for South Norfolk and North Ipswich, who has similar expertise. I just wonder whether the studies that she and he quoted also look at the prevalence of these illnesses in society as a whole, and whether they're correlated with the recent decline in cannabis use. Has that led to a decline in these illnesses? And did it lead to a rise when there was a rising use of cannabis? And is there a greater incidence of these illnesses in countries with high cannabis use than there is in countries with low cannabis use? Or has such research not yet been done?
Many thanks. The studies that I'm quoting didn't specifically answer the questions that you're raising, but they do indicate that people with particular vulnerabilities may be more likely to develop mental health problems, but also individuals who use cannabis in a heavy and sustained way, and that there wasn't necessarily an issue in terms of people requiring a vulnerability to go on to develop depression or anxiety. I hope that answers some of your points, but perhaps not all. In terms of physical health, it also appears that the main risk from cannabis is from the tobacco, and that it is often smoked with, although it has been reported that cannabis smoking carries a greater risk of smoking-related disease than tobacco alone, which is cited from the British Lung Foundation in 2012. It has also been reported that cannabis can affect fertility, and new research has found that the cannabis plant also contains cancerogenic mutagens that can affect people's lungs. I think, in concluding, I would agree, and it is my position, that certainly further research and perhaps addressing the level of schedulisation of cannabis would be particularly helpful for medical conditions, and that at some point in the future there may be a case for prescribed use for certain medical conditions where that is shown to have an ameliorative effect for individuals in terms of their health. I think, though, overall there also appear to be significant mental and some physical health concerns associated with cannabis use, which necessitates that very careful consideration is given to the most effective methods of managing and addressing this issue and any future changes to legislation. Many thanks.
So I'm going to call Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you very much, Ms. And I congratulate the member for Newport West for bringing this petition and all those who signed the petition. And that's probably the last time I'm going to remember the name of a constituency. I haven't got to grips with that, so I'm probably just going to point quite a lot. It's clear from the petition that cannabis and its production, use and legislation is an issue of real importance to the people of the United Kingdom. I received an email from a constituent yesterday informing that more people in Scotland signed it than anywhere else, that Glasgow was the city with the highest number of signatories, and that in fact my own constituency of Glasgow North East had one of the highest rates of signing. For that reason, and as the SNP spokesperson on civil liberties, I'm very pleased to be making my contribution. The frustration that the signatories to the petition must feel is that whilst the issue evokes strong emotion in different quarters, there is no settled demand for any specific change in the legislation. Even today, most of the speakers, however they felt about it, acknowledged the other side of the debate. I don't envy those who have to make these decisions, but what I do say is that I'll echo everyone else's calls for much more research so that we can get to the bottom of this argument. The debate also reflects some of the idiosyncrasies of the current devolutionary settlement, in that control of drugs is reserved under the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, reserved to this Parliament, but the treatment and prevention of drugs problems is devolved to the Scottish Government. And on the one hand, this does reflect an unhelpful division in an area of policy which is too important to have a fragmented approach, but it also illustrates that there are a number of facets to this issue. Harm reduction and public health on the one hand, and the issues of legality and criminalisation on the other hand. And there is a very strong argument that says, and I've heard it a couple of times today, that public health should be the focus when looking at drugs and alcohol use and misuse. And the argument from my friend from some constituency, which I'm sure is wonderful, North Norfolk, made the point that he believes that it should be health that looks at this, not justice, and that is a pretty strong argument. I know in Wales they do things differently. Obviously, health has devolved to Wales, and I'd be interested to find out their testing centres where they test substances, so that those who choose to use those illegal substances can find out what's actually in it. I'd be interested to hear more about the impact of those testing centres. Taking a multifaceted approach to this issue stands in contrast to the often ill-informed populism which has, as many members have said, I think the member here also said, often decided policy in the past under all governments. So there's a need for much more research and more definitive conclusions to remove this debate from the realms of an ill-informed populism on both sides of the debate at times, or from an abstract legalism on the other. Many members will know cases of very real difficulties criminal records cause those in the poorest communities on the one hand, and that those communities are also often the ones most heavily blighted by antisocial use of drugs. And I want to, at this point, do a bit of a Jeremy Corbyn and provide a voice for my constituents, because I have, like most members, had many emails on this. So I'm just going to quote a couple of them because they've asked me to be their voice here today, although they have differing views on this. So Drew from Rob Royston in my constituency said, "I understand arguments on both sides, but it's hypocritical that we freely sell and consume substances such as alcohol and tobacco, but prosecute those who choose to ingest less harmful, as he says, drugs." But Caroline says, "My brother was managing his schizophrenia until he started cannabis." William asked me this question: "If the Misuse of Drugs Act is there to prevent social harm and alcohol and tobacco aren't illegal, why am I made to be a criminal for smoking cannabis?" And then another constituent: "The fact that alcohol is legal is not an argument for also legalising cannabis. If we were considering legalising alcohol today, would we?" The petitioners may not get all their campaigning for today, but or they may. I have no idea what the Minister is going to say today. But they need to know that their arguments are being listened to. And the best way to do that is to commit to properly researching the issues. Those opposed to the petition would surely also be satisfied with that, because they believe that research will back up their arguments. It's a win-win for the government, and I would urge the Minister to commit to that today. One of the clearest things we already know from the research that's already been done is how much work remains to be done. The effects of alcohol and tobacco are now very well documented in our society, and the Scottish Government continues to stand up for public health in the face of industry pressure and sometimes public pressure via its minimum pricing regulation. However, the health effects of cannabis at a societal level, its relation to other drugs including tobacco, and its relationship, causal or otherwise, with mental health problems do require further study. A very close associate of mine has bipolar. She was a regular user of cannabis. She asked 2 different psychiatrists, did that make it worse? And one said yes, and the other said no. She asked both psychiatrists, did it cause my bipolar? And one said possibly, and the other said you possibly started to use it to cope with the effects of an undiagnosed condition. And that's the problem, that there is, despite I have heard a couple of members today saying that there is conclusive evidence, but there is no conclusive evidence that it doesn't exacerbate pre-existing mental health problems. And anyone with any experience of mental illness would never support anything that was going to exacerbate or cause psychotic episodes. And then the other argument is, does alcohol exacerbate mental health conditions? But if it is found, if the research is done, if it is found that it really does have a serious impact on people's mental health, then that would be a strong argument against it. And on the other hand, we then have the physical conditions to look at, and we've heard much today about medicinal cannabis. I want to just say something about someone who emailed me, and I think she probably emailed everyone. Her name is Michelle Ann. She was demonstrating today outside, and she's possibly in the public gallery just now. And she described the physical symptoms of some of her conditions. I can't read it all out, but she talked about waking up, and before she moves, she has to fight spasms, cramps, electric shocks. She described it as like being thrown into a bed of nettles. And she spoke movingly of how from using what she referred to as organic, well-grown, cured cannabis, she now feels happy, sleepy, hungry, all welcome benefits to her. Whilst we've heard arguments in favour of legalisation, it's clear that it's really not a panacea. The evidence from the United States, the states who've proceeded with decriminalisation, indicates a real variety of outcomes. All parties would probably benefit from a continued study of those jurisdictions and those of our European neighbours to inform policy in this country. It's surely a gift to us that we don't have to rely on debating to come to a conclusion. We have evidence all around the world and other countries willing to share it with us. And as the member for Newport West said, they've done the work for us, so let's use it. And whilst there are clear arguments against legalisation, the House would do well to heed some of the very real problems associated with the policy as it stands today. Those from our poorest communities and BME communities are affected most severely by the criminalisation policy. Mr. Lilly talked about the morality, and I would put it another way. I would say that there is quite a snobbish attitude towards cannabis as opposed to other drugs. And as the other members have said, it would appear from various media reports that those that are maybe of a kind of middle to upper class background can partake in illicit substances in their university days without ever jeopardising their future career. But many people from a working class background, a drugs-related conviction, no matter how minor, can have a devastating impact on their life chances in terms of employment. Let's also consider one group of primarily BME users, and that is Rastafarians. Their use of cannabis is part of their religious and spiritual beliefs. I'm probably the only speaker here today, you can prove me wrong if you like, but probably the only speaker here today whose partner is a Rastafarian. And he's probably the only Rastafarian, oh, I might get shot down in flames for this, who has never used cannabis. It's not compulsory for Rastafarians to use cannabis. However, it is part of their spiritual outlook. And he has asked the question, well, where are my civil liberties if I choose to do that because it's part of my religious beliefs? Where are my civil liberties if it criminalises me? I'll end by making one final point. The international context of our drug legislation must be considered. The United Nations Drug Conventions are now all over a quarter of a century old, and there's growing anticipation ahead of the international discussions in 2016, which will be informed by a far broader base of evidence accumulated in the interim period. It's noteworthy that some of those countries who requested those discussions be brought forward are very much at the forefront of what was once called the war on drugs. The government should ensure that the UK participates fully in the UN discussions on drugs policy. This will allow us to act responsibly on the international stage, using UK evidence to inform international approaches and utilising the latest international research to influence our policy here on these islands.
Thank you, Mrs. Gillam. It's an absolute pleasure to be called to speak under your chairmanship. Can I start by thanking the Petitions Committee for scheduling this debate today, and my honourable friend from Newport West for his measured and well-researched contribution. I think the e-petition process is an invaluable addition to our democracy, as it ensures that we can directly respond to the interests of the British public, and this can only be a good thing. The petition which sparked this debate was signed by 125,000 people in just 4 days. It's clear that there is a degree of public interest in the legal status of cannabis, and it's right that we carefully consider this issue. And I think that the quality of debate today has allowed us to do precisely that. But it is clearly not, I think, the end of the debate. Since the late 1990s, there's been a significant reduction in cannabis use in Britain, particularly amongst the young. According to Home Office statistics, nearly 30% of 16 to 24-year-olds had used cannabis in 1998. In 2014-15, it was a little over 16%, and that's despite the fact that this percentage slightly increased over the past 2 years from 13%. We're still on a positive trend, although I think it would be invaluable to understand what's driven the increase in the past 2 years. I wonder if it's related to cuts that we've seen in youth services. I think it's also important to note that during this time there's also been an increase in synthetic cannabinoids. Portugal, as has been discussed in this debate, and other countries have chosen to decriminalise cannabis and other drugs, and I know some would like to see us to go down the same route here in Britain. And when considering lessons from Portugal, we should be clear that their drug policy is far from permissive. It removes criminal penalties for simple possession of small amounts rather than wholesale decriminalisation of possession, supply and production offences. Those caught with drugs are summoned before a tribunal, or rather a dissuasion commission, which includes a psychiatrist, a social worker, who often mandate rehabilitation services or issue financial penalties. There is still a concerted effort made by law enforcement, working in conjunction with the health service, to reduce drug use and especially control production and supply. I am aware that Bjorn Hibbel's study of European drug trends shows that cannabis use is being reduced amongst the Portuguese young. However, we must recognise that cannabis use is going down even faster amongst British youths, though from a higher base. Amongst older groups in Portugal, there has been an increase in use of cannabis and other decriminalised drugs. I understand that one of the reasons that many people may have signed the petition is that too many people, young and old, feel that they have had their lives blighted by a conviction for the possession of cannabis. A conviction may well prevent somebody from getting a job whilst it's still on their record, and some professions, in law, accountancy and medicine, even require the disclosure of spent convictions. Our police have discretion over how to enforce the law against possession. In some areas, such as Durham, that means a force-wide policy of not charging people for possession or even growing their own plants. In other areas, individual police officers are allowed to make their own judgment, and that includes charging people with a first offence and a possibility of a custodial sentence. We have de facto criminalisation in some parts of the country and enforcement in others. This is an extraordinary postcode lottery. Given a drug conviction has such a serious impact on a person's life, I think that this postcode lottery is simply unacceptable. And we should also recognise racial disparities. Black people, on average, use drugs less than white people. They're 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs. I think this inequity needs to stop. So can I say gently to the Minister, I think that what we lack at the moment is some government direction and leadership. And if this debate does nothing more, I would hope it would flag up to the Minister that he might have some work to do to ensure the equity of law across the country and for all citizens. I know that the Honourable Member for Newport West has consistently campaigned for the use of cannabis to be legalised for medicinal purposes, and today he's made that case again with characteristic eloquence and sincerity. And I really do have enormous sympathy for anyone who seeks the most effective way to access pain relief. I don't doubt the reports made by those with multiple sclerosis and other illnesses that drugs can bring pain relief and improve muscle control. However, I do not believe that we need to legalise cannabis in order to have access to its medical benefits. THC, the active ingredient in cannabis, is used as an ingredient in the drug Sativex, which we've heard earlier today, and it's already licensed in the UK, in Wales, to relieve the symptoms of NS and other medical conditions. We can and do benefit from THC without legalising form of cannabis, which are used recreationally. And I understand that this is something that that government's drug advisors, the Advisory Council of Misuse on Drugs, supports. I'm also aware that Sativex is not available on the NHS in England due to the cost of the drug. Whilst that is ultimately a decision for NICE, and I accept that, I would ask that ministers look at this again. Sativex is, after all, available on prescription in Wales, as I've said, and MS sufferers in England shouldn't face greater pain and difficulty just because they live the wrong side of a border. Despite the medical benefits of THC, which can be accessed through Sativex, there remains real public concerns about the negative impact that recreational cannabis has on health, and I do share many of those concerns. My main worry about the drug is its impact on mental health, as eloquently outlined by the member from Central Suffolk and North Ipswich. We know that regular users are more likely to develop psychotic illnesses, including schizophrenia, and there is also a link between cannabis use and developing depression or anxiety, particularly amongst those who started smoking cannabis young as adolescents. Britain has some of the highest rates of mental illness in the world. The Mental Health Foundation and Mind tell us that 1 in 4 Britons suffer from a mental health problem over the course of each year. According to the ONS, 15% of us will seriously contemplate suicide at some point in our lifetime. And given these mental health concerns, I think it would be irresponsible to support measures which may make the drug more readily available, something likely to occur if we legalised the drug. As I understand it, Holland abandoned its model of completely ignoring personal possession due to the impact of the drug on mental health conditions. This is all rather worrisome, especially given the potency of cannabis on our streets. According to the Home Office's most recent potency study, intensively grown cannabis, which is the most common form of the drug in the UK, has on average a 15% THC concentration. Traditional cannabis, if there is such a thing, has just 9%. Strong strands of cannabis have all the more impacts on minds. We also have a growing problem of synthetic cannabinoids. So in conclusion, I'd like to ask appropriate ministers to look again at Sativex and the use of cannabis for those with particular physical conditions that can be alleviated by the drug. I also believe that the minister should look at the postcode lottery of criminalisation due to cannabis possession and use, and I am not persuaded of the case of the legalisation of cannabis. In this place, I believe we should always have mind to the impact of our actions on public health. Legalisation will not, I believe, improve this. Legalisation does have the potential to exacerbate the problems we have with drug dependency and with mental illness.
I intend to call Mr. Flynn at the end, the proposer. He's indicated he would like to speak. Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Gillan, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship yet again this afternoon. And can I welcome the new Shadow Minister to her role? I didn't get an opportunity at Home Office questions earlier on. We're friends, which is a dangerous thing in this place, and we agree on many things, and actually I agree on most of the things that she actually said in her commentary today. Can I start by saying I'm not from the university elite that smoked cannabis when I went to university. I'm not cynical, I'm not horrible, I hope. And I worked very closely with the Honourable Member for North Norfolk when he was a Shadow Health Minister, when I was a Shadow Health Minister, and when he was the Mental Health Minister in different roles. I have every sympathy for my friends and members of my family that have had MS, and the terrible, terrible pain and anguish they go through from an incurable disease. So I start from the premise of having sympathy, and let's see what we can do about it in the 21st century to take people out of that environment. But I do have real concerns about legalising cannabis in the way that it's been described for probably 40 years by Donald Joe, and I congratulate him on his position being unchanged, and my right honourable friend, whose position I knew as I walked into the room and expected him to be sitting there when I came into this debate. But I think it is significant, Mrs. Gillan, that the two contributions from people that are medically qualified and actually know on a day-to-day basis from the medical side, not from anecdotal or from the patient's point of view, their contribution I think has been enormously significant. I also agree that I think this debate would have been ever so more useful if we would have talked about the medical side and the help rather than the general debate. I also think that if I could just make a tiny bit more progress, and then I promise I will go, you know, I always think this that way. While we've had a huge petition of people that are for it, I'm sure colleagues in the House have also had people writing to them saying no, as was made by the SNP Shadow Minister a moment ago. There's no petition from those that do not want to change the legislation. There's a large petition from those that do. And I think a significant minority also need to be observed within this debate. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. I don't think there's any dispute about risk, medical risk. It's the question of how one responds to it. And does he really think it's appropriate to give someone, perhaps who's suffering from mental ill health, to end up giving them a criminal record for doing this?
I think that's, to be fair, different from the point I was trying to make. And we know that with the modern way we police, not just in the last 5 years, but for many, many years, the discretion of a police officer to make a decision is an operational decision for them and not for politicians to make, and not, by the way, for police and crime commissioners to make. So I know the commentary from the Durham PCC, who has said that's not his decision. That is an operational decision for the chief constable on a day-to-day basis. That's not what PPCs were set up for. Now, I know we now have cross-party support for police and crime commissioners, which I'm really pleased of the conversion of the Labour Party since the election. And that's not a snipe. Oh, yes, it is. But I'm really pleased that there has been a change, because there are excellent PCCs out there, and they do an excellent job. I am also conscious that there are devolved administrations looking at this differently. And I'll come on to some of the points that I was making. But if I can, I think let's see what positives can come out of this, because I am not going to stand here and say we are going to legalise cannabis. I'm not going to say that from a moral position or from a personal position or from a government position. But I do think that we could look carefully, as was alluded to by my honourable friend from Suffolk Central and North Ipswich, that we need to look at the research and to see why the research isn't taking place and what effects certain parts of the legislation are taking today. So, for instance, believe it or not, Mrs. Gillard, I did take a week off. The week before last, I went to Norfolk, my favourite part of Norfolk, the Norfolk Broads, and I spent a week fishing while my wife and my mother-in-law looked at the other beautiful parts of Norfolk. And I used a lot of hemp. And hemp, as we probably know, is the seeds. We've gone back to the seeds earlier on. I live in Hemel Hempstead. I represent Hemel Hempstead. Some of the bread that some of us buy has a hemp seed in it. Part of the problem that my honourable friend was alluding to as to why are seeds legal, that's part of the rationale behind it. But that doesn't mean we should not look at it, and we look carefully at it. And we shouldn't be anything in statute, I think, that actually prevents research into improving the quality of people's lives. And I think I'll go away from here and work with the other departments to see how we can do that. Now, there was lots of discussion, and I know my good friend, the Honourable Lady for North Down, alluded to what would happen, for instance, with the Republican response. The sad thing is, as I know as a previous minister and served in Northern Ireland in a different sort of uniform, is that these thugs and these organised criminals will find something else to destroy their communities with by raising money, the same as what they've done with diesel laundering and other things over years. So I don't think legalisation will make a huge difference in what they do. It may make a huge difference to the lives of her constituents, which I think, as we've heard today, has whether the mental or the physical evidence that's coming forward. And the other discussion, and I know this, I have this discussion myself with my constituents, is there is very diverse views as to where we should be on this subject. We are at one on wanting to protect our constituents. We're just perhaps looking at it in a different way. Going back to the point that my former honourable friend made a moment ago, mental health protection of vulnerable people is probably one of the most difficult and most important areas that we have, which is why I'm so pleased that so many police forces now have, with the work we did in the past, mental health professionals with them on the streets, in the custody suites, and less and less 135, 136 is being administered by the police. And as we've heard also, there is conflicting evidence going back to do with studies across the world. The majority of the world hasn't legalised it. There's movement, but the majority of the world is roughly within the position of where we are. And in Portugal, which is where the Shadow Minister talked extensively on, and I think absolutely correctly, they have a completely different strategy, not only through their health service, as to how they work with people and how they go forward. I have the Washington Institute, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, said only last month that it's too early to decide whether what's going on there is going to work. And they think it won't happen until at least 2017, is the evidence I have before me. If I can just make some progress, just for a second, and then I will give way to him, because he's going to sum up at the end, as I understand, and Mrs. Gillan as well. There is always going to be one expert in one part of the world saying one thing, and another expert in another world saying another thing, not least because there will be such diverse views in this. But we have to listen to what goes on and use it as an evidence base, which is what was being asked for earlier on. Holland, really interesting situation with Holland. There's different statistics being given out to us today. The latest statistics I have, I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong I will write to colleagues to make sure they know. The latest figure for the UK is 6.5, 6.7 according to the British Crime Survey 14-15. The latest figures for Holland is 7%, larger than us. They legalised, and they have a different situation again. Now, why it's dropping with us, it still stayed higher with Holland. I'm not saying what Holland has done is wrong. They're an independent country, and it's absolutely right and proper for them to have their own policy. But when we look at, we compare us with them, we mustn't actually turn around and perhaps use some statistics which may well be out of date or not. Now, if my figures are out of date, then I apologise to this debate this afternoon, and I will write to all your colleagues. There were other points, I think, that was made during the course of the debate, which I would actually not only like to write to colleagues about, I'd like to write to every colleague about, those that haven't been able to come here today, and answer some of those queries and those problems. And I would say to the Honourable Lady for Brighton and Hove, I think it is now, rather than Brighton Pavilion, Brighton Hove. Yeah, Brighton Pavilion. I apologise, my civil service will be told off later on for the notes I got given. Don't believe everything that Ipsos Mori say or any other pollster says. In 2010 I was supposed to have lost my seat and I returned with a 13,000 majority. Pollsters get it wrong, and it's about the question of, and the Honourable Lady can shake her head and do different things. It's a fact, we were supposed to have not won the election, and we did. All I'm saying is that there are different views. There are different views as to what pollsters can say and what pollsters can, but we have a job to make sure that we protect our community. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. I was only shaking my head because the issue about the poll was one tiny thing in an overall case that I've been making and my colleagues have been making, and the case has been about looking at the evidence. And frankly, I find it quite shocking to hear both from him and sadly from the Shadow Minister, no real interest in looking at the evidence. Yes, we've had two medical people speaking here, but there is plenty of medical evidence out there that suggests that, for example, freeing up cannabis for medicinal use is a positive thing to do. Will he undertake to look at the evidence?
Minister.
I'm not certain if the Honourable Lady was listening to what I said. I'm not certain of the Honourable, but I suggest you read Hansard tomorrow morning, because we have a cross-agreement here that we will look at research and see how we can help people. That is something I'm committed to, and I know we will try to, but it's not something I can just do in the Home Office, it has to be done across the board. That, to me, is the most important thing that comes out of this debate. Not, I'm right, anybody's wrong. At the end of the day, let's try and work out what can be and what can help individuals within the community. Of course I will.
So keen to look at evidence. Could he reread the report of the Select Committee, with a Tory majority, looked at the subject very seriously for a whole year, and came up with this conclusion that what happened in Portugal was entirely beneficial, with no harmful effects, and is now supported by all parties in Portugal and the police. And why does he think an anecdotal sideswipe at that is going to mean anything? And isn't he relying again on an evidence-free policy, instead of going back and taking up the recommendation of the Select Committee, which was to set up a Royal Commission on this?
Mrs. Gillen, the Honourable Gentleman is never going to change his view. That's his view. That's fine. If I, from a statutory position, he chances on again. Let's try and listen to what the Royal Colleges have said. That, to me, are experts. The Select Committee took evidence. I've sat on Select Committees. I know exactly what's going on. I will come and give evidence to the Select Committee only in the next couple of days, I think next week. What is crucial is that we do not set ourselves in one position and we say what research could help, what research could take this argument forward. That's what I've committed to do, and I think that is a very important thing. I will give way, and then I will conclude.
I'm very grateful for his patience, and I'm delighted that he visited the Norfolk Broads, and I wonder whether, when he was there, he enjoyed a pint in one of the many Norfolk Broad pubs. There is very clear evidence that alcohol is more dangerous than cannabis. It's overwhelming, the evidence. Can he just explain, can he give any explanation as to why it makes sense for that more dangerous product to be legal and for a less dangerous product to be illegal?
Well, I'm not actually convinced on the evidence that cannabis in certain people is less dangerous. But I would say that if, and as it was said earlier on the debate, is where would we start from today with alcohol policy and tobacco policy than where we are today? Of course we wouldn't. And I think I accept that point. But in conclusion, I'm committed to working with other departments and whoever else wants to work with us to make sure that in the 21st century, where this can be helpful through the pharmaceuticals, we will try and make sure that happens. Let's look at the research, let's look work out I can see to do, which is what I'm committed to do. And with that, I think it's been enormously useful, Mrs. Gillen, that we've had a debate, but my position is I cannot support the petition.
The debate has missed the point, I'm afraid, as usual. It's not my debate, it's the debate of the 220,000 people who tried a new procedure in this House, there's only a second example of it, in order to ask that we debate this. And our chief task in this Parliament is to restore the reputation of this place. Democracy was invented in Greece 2,500 years ago, and it's come to us in stages. And there were people who had expectations that, having signed the petition, having a debate here tonight, we'd have had a positive, sensible, constructive answer from the government. They've been disappointed. And the great myth that's perpetrated is that if you ban something, people don't use it. If you make something illegal, it stops being used, when the reverse is true. The prohibition that we introduced in 1971 has been a continuing disaster. We've heard medical evidence from the same source, and we have to take that seriously, of course. But it's not related, I'm afraid, in very little percentages that we have, to the extent of the danger. And I remind you of what Dr. Nutt said, that you'd have to get rid of cannabis in the cases of 5,000 people to stop one case of psychosis. Now, that still makes it a serious problem. But the great lesson of prohibition is that people are suffering greatly for it, people have been criminalized, and their lives have been ruined. And I only have 2 minutes. And to make this final point, of all those, and there are tens of thousands of them, who have written to us in passion letters about their suffering and saying in order to get their drug of choice, and it's a natural substance, not a chemical one like Satovix, the natural form of cannabis which have been used for 5,000 years without any serious side effects. They want the government to move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. Simple, could be done, just been done in 23 states in America without any harm. And I would beg the government to look again at the evidence, to rescue those sufferers from MS, to rescue them from their bed of thistles.
Mr. Flynn, have you sat down, or are you letting Mr. Lilly intervene?
I'm letting him in. Thank you.
Surely the honourable gentleman would agree that the one argument which those opposing our position have lent upon is the evidence of the Institute of Psychology, or the College of Psychology, Psychiatry, that studies have shown. The very fact that studies can be carried out of people who use and do not use cannabis shows that the act is, the present prohibition is not effective.
Absolutely.
It also suggests that actually, although there may be health risks exactly as they have indicated, the incidence of those health risks will probably not be altered by legalization, whereas all the other issues which he and I have raised would be ameliorated. And we hope, surely, that the Minister will take that account in his further consideration.
The Honourable Gentleman said it's this belief that's still here. Recently, one of the drugs, the legal highs, was criminalised. The result in my area was to increase its use by 300%. You can't go on believing that we are the masters of the universe. What we're doing is throwing 2-3 million of our young people into the hands of gangsters who are irresponsible. And what we should do is to make sure that these drugs are controlled, where we can keep them out of the hands of people with mental ill health, keep them out of others whose health might be threatened, pregnant women, others who suffer in that way. That's the point of a controlled drug, and we'll only get it controlled with legalization. And we carry on with the chaos and the waste and the cruelty if we continue with our mistaken policy of prohibition.
The question is that this House has considered the e-petition relating to making the production, sale and use of cannabis legal. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, order, order.